From exploding dresses to modern corsets, clothing hasn't always been very comfortable for women. Sometimes it's dangerous. So let's you and me take a look at some time periods that prove just how painful fashion can be. Corsets, as we know them, first made a splash about 400 years ago. But in this video, I'll be focusing on a practice called tight corseting. That's where you get such a tiny waist you can't do much of anything else. And that has been the center of debate after debate about their usefulness versus the damage they may do. Initially, aristocratic women were expected to wear them as a sign of social status. Of course, it didn't take long for women of all social classes to cave to societal expectations about how they should look. A lot of them, regardless of their income level, permanently deformed their bodies because men largely determined the silhouette that a woman's body should have, regardless of the toll it might take on her health. Go ahead and ask me why I'm the salty historian. Moving on. Okay, so what was a corset and what did it do? Initially, it was considered a supportive undergarment. It was stiff, unbendable, made of materials like whalebone or steel. Then there were the laces. A woman could cinch her waist to nearly grotesque proportions, so she could fit into smaller, unforgiving clothing, rather than clothing fitting her exactly as she was. Chesticles were elevated to all new heights. Waists, as I said, were as tiny as possible. And hips, well, they should prove that a woman would be great in childbirth. Except corsets were so restrictive, they could make it incredibly difficult to get or stay pregnant, let alone give birth. Even women who were pregnant were expected to wear the damn things every day for their entire pregnancy. So in the 19th century, a woman called Roxy Ann Kaplan talked to her husband. He was a doctor and anatomist. And with his help, she developed the maternity corset. Allegedly, it promoted hygiene, was made from elastic, buttons instead of metal clasps, and more lightweight fabric. The elastic allowed those poor pregnant women to loosen their corset as their belly grew. Hey, you got to keep up that tiny figure even when you're puking every morning, am I right? Oh, and when they did deliver, it was often a far more difficult and painful experience than it needed to be, thanks to the narrowing of organs. According to M. Davies in a 1982 paper, corseting likely contributed directly to a general decreased fertility and increased stillbirths. Oh, and by the way, if this shit kept a woman from carrying to term, men blamed them for conforming to the standards that men had demanded of them. Ain't history fun, kids? Speaking of the pregnancy problem, throughout history, women have been forced to become pretty creative about certain things. For example, it's thought that many women tightened their corsets to such an extent that they could prevent or end unwanted, we'll call it gestation. Oh, and corsets would also destroy a woman's sex drive. Not that that mattered to certain men, if you catch my meaning. So those grotesque dimensions. Yeah, so a lot of the time men wanted to see a nice, exaggerated hourglass figure. And women began cinching their waists so tight they resembled wasps. Yeah, so check this out. In the 1830s, the average woman's waist was about 27 inches, cinched down to 22 inches. In the 1850s and 60s, the average woman's waist was about 28 inches, cinched to 20. The 1870s saw the average woman's waist at about 26 inches, cinched to 18. And in the early 1900s, the average woman's waist was about 27 inches, cinched to 16. Some women managed to reduce their weights to a mere 12 to 14 inches and were admired for it. Y'all, the length of my kid's foot is more inches than that. And regardless of how impressive that might sound, it often came with a steep price. Studies of women's skeletons from the Victorian age offer us a look into just how bad this could be. Ribs could literally be broken. The lower ribs could be permanently deformed, causing lung atrophy or collapse, meaning not being able to take a deep breath or any breath ever again. As such, fainting wasn't all that uncommon. Internal organs could be compressed. There was reduced digestive function, like I said, infertility, and more. Sources I read said that a lot of those issues arose because of childhood corseting. Yeah, and that shit was so ingrained in society, mothers were expected to teach their daughters to wear a corset by the time they were 14, but sometimes earlier. And they learned looking good for men was far more important than being able to sit comfortably, or eat, or have the energy to walk. In some cases, if a girl's body wasn't changing fast enough, she might be forced into a special corset that she couldn't unclasp without help, and then had to sleep in every night. I suppose we should consider attitudes towards women in that time period. So at that time, and basically every time, Women were deemed intellectually inferior. And well, if she was going to do something as silly as wearing a corset, didn't that make it acceptable to dismiss her pain? Make her endure agony? I mean, who the hell chose suffering over comfort? Men never demanded that. Fuck's sake. Oh, and let's not forget, wearing those stiff corsets could lead to muscle atrophy, meaning women could not stop wearing them because their back and core muscles were so weak, they wouldn't have been able to stay upright without their bindings. To be fair, they warned of the health issues, but often the allure of the ideal figure was more important to women. Gotta find a husband, right? And there were the times that women outright abandoned the corsets, like during the suffrage movement, when, heaven forbid, women wanted rights and to be able to breathe at the same time they had them. There was the invention of girdles and brassieres, but those are still constrictive, kids. Literally, one of the best parts of the day is getting home and taking off your fucking bra. But I digress. Despite the discomfort, corsets have never really ever gone away. And today, there are women reclaiming the look and the silhouette according to their standards, making their own decision to do it rather than it being compulsory. Okay, before you come at me, yes, men have worn corsets at certain points in history, and we're seeing them a lot more lately, but it's always been far less stringent for men. They could choose to discontinue wearing them at any point or never wear them because they were men. And women? How could they possibly have a brain cell in their head to be able to decide such a thing? Since they first appeared, corsets have had their staunch supporters and definite detractors, and there's never been a lack of disdain from either side. Obviously, there's a lot more to the history of corsets and how they've changed or been replaced or revived over time. Thankfully, and as I said, it's a personal choice to wear them. Often they're worn temporarily, like at Ren fairs, while others prefer to train their waists. Regardless, and to repeat, it is a choice. Thank fuck for that. But right, you want to know about the exploding dresses. Well, suffice to say, and as I mentioned, fashion has rarely been about comfort. And when women of certain time periods decided to change that, they quite literally risked their lives, jumping right out of the frying pan and into the fire. If you really want to know more about that, I wrote about it in my column for Last Girls Club. My column is called Ask Me Why I'm Salty, and Last Girls Club is a quarterly magazine. My piece about this subject appears in the summer 2024 issue. There is literally no requirement that you check it out, but it would be really cool if you did.